very much. Thank you. On behalf of the dean of the department, Professor Wratislavienses, and on behalf of myself, of course, I'm the vice dean responsible for research and international relations at this department. I am very happy and honored to welcome such a prominent scholar and professor. And it is really a privilege we can host you, and it is also a pleasure. And I hope, and I'm really convinced, it will be an occasion for us to learn a lot and to find very many new inspirations.
So, very briefly, about whom I'm pleased to host here. It's quite rare that in the Faculty of Social Science at the university such a distinguished known host, so guests are visiting us. So we are very pleased to have Prof Michael Burawoy, who is mostly known now for public sociology ideas, but in fact he started quite unusually for our field, at least at this moment, as mathematician. Yes? So the first degree Professor Burawoy is from Cambridge in mathematics, then degree in sociology and at the University of Zambia at the moment when the method was also developed, excellent case method, and then PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago. One of the very important mark which was made by Professor Burawoy in sociology was, as I already mentioned, to make popular and politically visible sociology at the global scale. As the president of the International Sociological Association, Professor Burawoy put a lot of effort in promoting the vision of sociology, which will not be just made out of ex-cathedra, yes, but it will be sociology which is socially and politically engaged with the participants, with people whom we study, and also co-responsible, so to say, to the work which we study. I think that's something which we very much need today, and that's why we are so pleased when Professor accepted our invitation to Wrocław, because not only in Poland but also worldwide, it seems that one of the possibilities to revive sociological thinking is indeed through closer engagement with various political and social movement actors. We'll hear today about public sociology. I have to add, and I'm pleased to add, that this visit is co-sponsored by the City of Wroclaw from the Visiting Professor program, but it's also supported by a range of other institutions. In fact, first of all, we should mention that Professor Burawoy was first at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań and visiting the conferences and keynotes for the anniversary of Scientiae work. But then this visit is also supported by the Polish Sociological Association, it's supported by the rector of the University of Wroclaw, the director, so a lot of people put their bit to this visit, and I would like to thank all of them. So, Professor Burawoy, I will take more time. Please.
Very much for the invitation, for the welcome, Vice Dean Zuber, and well, for people coming out on this beautiful sunny day to listen to something about public sociology. Yes, it sounds like I'm in a historically very important place. Of course, in the United States, universities, if they're 100 years old, that makes them ancient. So you know, this is a very distinguished place. I didn't realize there were 3 original universities. Lord Vilnius and Wrocław. Yeah. All right. So good. So I'm supposed to be talking about public. I was told this was the title that Adam gave me. Public sociology. Why do we need it? Now, who am I talking to here? Are you mainly sociologists? No.
Yeah, especially who.
Do you want to know? Can you just say quickly who you are and what you do? So I have an idea.
I came from Slovakia, but I studied in Czech Republic, and I came here for your presentations. I studied sociology and also with environmental studies, and now I just started my PhD as environmental studies department.
Okay, and two colleagues and I are from China. We are studying for PhD of pedagogy here in another university.
I'm a sociologist. I'm from University of Wroclaw. It's in Poland. I'm a PhD student, and I'm writing a thesis about counter-hegemonic globalization.
Yes.
I'm a PhD student from University of Wroclaw. I'm studying studies of civilization and sociology.
I'm a master student of university.
You're from here?
Yeah, I'm from Azerbaijan. I study Intercultural Mediation program.
Alright, very good. So, yes, so let me just say a few words of introduction. We have 2 hours and then we actually... And I'll try and speak for about another half hour. Alright. And if I go too quickly, you just stick up your hand and tell me to slow down. When I get excited, I go more quickly. So yes, so I have as Adam has said, I have a varied career, and I came to sociology in a very devious way. But this idea of public sociology came to me when I was visiting South Africa. This was in 1990. I'd been in South Africa in 1968, and then I had left and spent time in Zambia, 4 years in Zambia. And then, as you may know, the African National Congress, which was the major political party in South Africa fighting against apartheid regime in South Africa, had declared a boycott of academic institutions, so I never went for many years to South Africa. But I was invited back in 1990. This was a year actually when Mandela was released from prison, the very famous freedom fighter and subsequent president of South Africa. And when I visited South Africa in 1990, I was very astonished by the sociology that they were doing in South Africa. It was a very engaged sociology. Sociologists were in fact part and parcel of the organization of a labor movement in South Africa. They organized courses for workers. These were in the universities in South Africa. They would bring in workers from the various factories and organized and taught them about industrial relations, about shop stewards. And so the sociologists actually were part and parcel of the struggle against apartheid. And they developed a very interesting sociology as a result. A sociology that did focus very much on the importance of social movements. Anyway, the point is I want to make is this was a sociology, an engaged sociology that I had not witnessed in the United States. In the United States, I don't know if it's true in Poland, but in the United States, sociology in the university is a very enclosed discipline. People write, do research, they write papers, and then they publish them and nobody reads them. They just, perhaps you circulate among your friends, but it's very much what I call a professional world. And so what was happening in South Africa was very different. And indeed, you might say, if one looks across the world, there are many places, sociology is very engaged, particularly in countries that have experienced widespread struggles, particularly those who've experienced struggles against colonialism or even struggles against state socialism. Sociologists have been very engaged. And it's an interesting history to look at the story of sociology in Poland, sociology in Hungary, and sociology in the Soviet Union. They're different stories, but all very interesting. And many of those sociologists were dissidents in the old so-called communist regime. Yeah. So anyway, that is by way of introduction. So the question is, if we are going to ask the question, what is public sociology? The first question is, what is sociology? Has anybody any idea what sociology? Ah, the gentleman over there.
You all study sociology. Nobody
Well, I would say that this is studying social phenomena. The question would be what is social phenomena. So this is difficult sometimes.
Sorry?
This is difficult because some paradigms are talking about the social structure, then about the social processes, and so on and so on.
And every time you say you want to explain sociology, you use the word social.
Yeah.
It's a big problem for sociologists. They don't know what sociology is. They are a lost discipline. Yeah. No.
So maybe we can, instead of social, say something about people. So use the word people in the definition.
Studying people processes.
No, people who are among each other.
What?
People who are together, groups of people.
Groups of people. Yes, interesting.
You could say that it's about interactions.
Interactions, yes, interesting, yes, interactions.
Power. About power.
Power of domination. I'll ask you something. It's a small group, so I can't lecture for the whole time. So anyway, let me just tell you what I think, and then you can disagree. So I think, for me, what is sociology? It was actually something that a fellow called C. Wright Mills, in a book called Sociological Imagination, which is a very popular book in the United States, England, and other places. He argued that sociology was connecting personal troubles to public issues. Personal troubles to public issues. That is to say, he was suggesting that as individuals, we have a particular vision of the world that is very individual-centered. We think of ourselves as having troubles, but actually many of us share those troubles, and they are linked to broader public issues. So one example that was often used was unemployment. When we are unemployed, we think that the problem is with ourselves. We have a trouble that we cannot get a job, and some people think it's because we're lazy, some people think it's because we don't have the right skill. And what sociologists say, well, we must look at exactly the social processes that produce unemployment. That is to say, to see the ways in which the economy actually generates unemployment on a systematic basis. So we see our personal troubles through the lens of a bigger set of processes. Yes. I mean, today, many of sociologists study something called precarity. These two gentlemen know a lot about precarity. And so the question is, how is it that our lives, our work, our occupations are so precarious? Is that a word we know, precarious? Probably the same word in Polish, right? Precarina, okay. So why today is there such a high levels of precarity in the labour market? That's an important question, and sociologists study it, but individuals experience precarity as uncertainty, as trouble, as inability to plan, but there are processes that generate precarity. Anyway, my point is that first and foremost, sociology for me,
At least it works, but otherwise.
so it's linking personal troubles to public issues. Yes. And there's another way of thinking about that is to link micro processes to macro forces. So, when Vice Dean Zuber introduced me, you were telling me about the history of this university. So here we are in this small room, but actually we have to think about what's going on in this small room in terms of the history of this university, the place of this university in the wider society. Then I can begin to understand you and why it is there are so many international students here, and why it is there are some sociology students from the university here. So we can understand what's going on here in this room by thinking of the wider forces. All right. So sometimes social movements, collective organizations link personal troubles to public issues. Very famously in this country, a movement that influenced me very deeply was the Solidarity movement, long before you were ever born, perhaps even before your parents were born. Maybe not. 1980-81 was an amazing social movement in this country, starting with a working class strike and struggle and dance. This was a movement in which the individual troubles, individual grievances were forged into a collective action, collective movement that actually spread throughout the country. Yes. Yes. So anyway, so social movements, collective, link often personal troubles to public issues in practice. All right. Actually, another aspect of this is, look, this Marx, Weber and Durkheim. I don't know if people read Marx, Weber and Durkheim anymore. Where I come from, everybody has to read Marx, Weber and Durkheim. And the whole essence of their theories, these are the big founding figures of sociology. Marx, of course, linked people's experiences at work with capitalism. Weber linked people's religious experiences with the generation of this system called capitalism, he called it modern Western bourgeois rational capitalism. Durkheim's a brilliant guy. Does anybody read Durkheim? Yes, you read Durkheim? Oh yeah, which book of Durkheim did you have to read? Suicide. I love suicide. I remember when I was very depressed. I was at university in Cambridge, and I got very depressed. I hated Cambridge University. I was a mathematician. I wasn't very good at mathematics. So I remember one day I was very depressed. I was sitting in the library, and there was this book on the desk, and it said suicide. And I thought, this is the book for me. So I looked at this book. It was by some French guy called Durkheim. I looked at the book, and it was very strange because suicide is a very individual thing. So it's, to explain suicide, you have to understand people's psychology. But there was Durkheim. He said, no, it's not individual, it's social. Different societies have different rates of suicide. Different occupations have different rates of suicide. Over time, suicide changes. It's not an individual, it's a function of society. That is the genius of Durkheim, to show how these personal troubles are actually issues of society. This is sociology. This is the excitement of sociology, to transcend the individual perspective. Anyway, so that book liberated me. So after reading that book, I thought, this is very interesting. I must become a sociologist. And actually, Durkheim liberated me from my depression, and I have been very happy ever after. Yes, that's right. All right. I could tell you many stories. But anyway, the point is that this linking of micro to macro is one of the essential features of these great sociologists. Okay, all right, and the social movements. So what's the difference between sociology on the one side and economics and political science? Some people say there's no difference, it's all social science. We should have one social science. I disagree. I think that actually sociology is very different from economics and political science. Economics is concerned with advancing the market. Political science is concerned with consolidating the state, government, power. And sociology is concerned with what we call civil society. So, economics, political science, sociology, and, well, this is the picture I would draw. This is the world in which we live today. In which, let's see if this works, this arrow. Oh, look at that, beautiful. Yes, the market is expanding, and it works very closely with the state, and is crushing, destroying, undermining civil society, which are those organizations, institutions, movements that are neither part of the state nor part of the economy. I'm going to need some water. Okay, now, thanks. So, sociology takes the standpoint of this civil society. That's the organizations, institutions, movements that are not part of the economy, not part of the state. I believe what is happening in the world today is that this civil society is being destroyed and crushed. Our autonomy is being crushed. We are subject to market despotism and state tyranny. You may or may not agree with me we can discuss that later. All right. So the point I'm trying to make is that sociology's perspective is from the standpoint of civil society. So it studies the economy, the market, from the standpoint, from the perspective of the relations in civil society. So on the one hand, sociologists say how the market requires social supports, networks of relations, but it also shows the way that markets destroy society. Markets destroying society. Yes. I mean, you could argue that as markets advance and as workers become ever more precarious because they have no protection, actually those markets actually undermine social relations. Relations in the family, relations of organizations, relations around social movements. Yes. And you may or may not think this is relevant to Poland, but we can discuss that, as I say, later. We'll see. Anyway, alright. I've been telling you what sociology is. Now let's talk about, oh yes, now I forgot about that beautiful market gets bigger, state gets bigger, and there's no longer any civil society. Third wave marketization. But what is public sociology? Well, public sociology is very simple. Sociology is brought to the people. Sociologists create an understanding of the world, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and the idea is to transmit that to the wider society. So, right, so bringing sociology to publics. And you may think it's obvious, yes, sociology has to be brought to publics, but actually a lot of sociology is having a sociologist just talking to one another. In fact, sometimes sociologists don't talk even to other sociologists, they just talk to themselves. So anyway, the idea of a public sociology is to take sociology to the wider world. And I'm going to suggest to you that that is very important. That is very important because markets and states are crushing society, and only by bringing sociological visions to a wider world can there be some sort of attempt at keeping market and state at bay. Defending civil society. This was a big project under communism, of course. A very important project trying to defend civil society, some sort of autonomous relations against the state. Today we have to defend civil society against the market. All right. So, all right. Let me get on with this. And if you have any questions on the way, just stick your hand up. Don't be shy. And you can speak in Polish. Somebody will help you. All right. So this is the story. Public sociology, as I just said, is this idea of bringing sociological perspective to the wider society. And there are two ways of doing this. One is a traditional way, in which sociologists write in newspapers, they do interviews on television, they have blogs, they work through social media, they transmit their ideas through media, one form or another. And that, of course, has happened in many ways in this country, in Poland, and continues to happen. The sociologists, I always remarked how many sociologists write in newspapers. You still have newspapers in Poland, right? Yes, still, just. Anyway, so sociologists will write in newspapers, they interview, television, radio, and will have their blogs. Do sociologists have blogs here? Yeah. For their public consumption. All right, very good. That's the traditional way. Disseminating ideas through media of one form or another. The other way is organic public sociology. In this way, sociologists work closely with groups, with social movements, with organizations. It's an unmediated relationship. An unmediated relationship. That is to say, it's a direct relationship. Yes. So Adam sort of is working with a trade union, and I come along as a sociologist, and we have a conversation. And we talk about the context within which the social movement, the labor movement, organizes. Yes. And sometimes these sociologists get very deeply embedded in the movement and they lose touch with sociology. Very dangerous move. The end of so they become so committed. In fact, you were telling me yesterday somebody started going to work for Amazon as a sociologist and then became an employee in Amazon. That was the end of sociology.
Dropped PhD.
And dropped his PhD, right? That can happen if you're an organic public sociologist. But he still keeps in touch with sociologists. So yes, so anyway, that's the organic close connection. So that's public sociology. Now, as I was said in the beginning, there is this other sociology, professional sociology, where this is what you do perhaps here in the university, where you develop theories, you do research. That's a sort of professional sociology in which your work, your research here actually builds slowly over time and transforms itself as it tries to comprehend, explain the wider society. So this is something that is enclosed within the university. Without this sociology, this understanding of the relationship between micro and macro, without developing that framework, public sociology cannot exist. There is no public sociology if there is not a professional sociology. Each requires the other. Yes. So that's professional sociology. Now, policy sociology is a sociology that is concerned with introducing new policies, often introduced by governments. Policies around abortion, for example. Policies around issues of poverty. Policies around education. So this is so many sociologists engage themselves in figuring out the solution of problems as defined by politicians, by people in government, bureaucrats, administrators. So they work on a problem and try to solve the problem. Yes. with their sociological theories and methodologies and expertise. Yes. Now you notice, how many boxes are there? 4. Sociologists only think in 4s. They love 2x2 tables. If any of you here want to become a sociologist, you have to generate your own distinctive 2x2 table. It will make your career. That is the way to make your career. But I've only got 3 types at the moment, so I need a 4th. Very good. Is that from your head or did you read? You're very diligent student, yes. So what is this critical sociology? Any ideas? Well, you see, critical sociology is sociology that criticizes professional sociology. Professional sociology works with sets of assumptions, and they're often unquestioned. The critical sociologist will actually engage in a critique. So perhaps, for example, the professional sociologist will be interested in pursuing a theory that is based on the expansion of democracy. Very important value. The critical sociologist might come along and say, actually, democratic freedoms are not the only things that are important. We also need to criticize the way the economy works and the ways in which the economy limits freedom. So we have to look not just at democracy, but we have to look at the market and its underlying conditions. So critical sociologists have often spent time criticizing, actually, market fundamentalism. That is the idea that markets are going to solve all social problems. And sociologists, beginning in the 19th century, Marx and Weber and Durkheim, and moving into the 20th century, have always insisted that actually markets are not necessarily the solution to problems, they also create problems. Yes, but anyway, critical sociologists engage in a criticism of the underlying values, perspectives of professional sociology. True.
Sorry, can I ask?
Absolutely.
This is the types that you invented after you were in Africa, or is it used typology? Because in relation to Poland, I think that we more often use something like the sociology, like the true sociology, and applied science, applied sociology, or engaged in. It's similar to anthropology, and yeah, what did you introduce? Because I remember also that you had an argument with Professor Stomka.
My good friend, Professor
Happens all the time here.
The last positivist. And actually he started to use those types in referring, and I don't remember if he referred to your typology or is it now more general?
Right. Oh, this is all very complicated. Yes. Well, first of all, these are my types, and other people have other types, and they are connected. But these are the types that I develop when I try to understand what is peculiar to public sociology. So distinguishing it from these other types. Yes, normally, sometimes one thinks of sociology as, on the one hand, we have professional or pure sociology and applied sociology. And that corresponds to the professional and the public, and the policy. But I, of course, believe there are these other types, the critical and the public, as also very important historically. And as to my debate with Professor Stomka, How does that fit in here? Yes, now he's very much committed. He's very much committed. It's not fair for me to talk about Professor Stamke. He's not here, but I will. He's very much committed to the professional sociology. And he has some policy sociology, but he really wants, and he's a bit sort of doubtful about the critical and the public. The criticism that Stamke makes generally is that the public sociology is dangerous because it's going to politicize sociology and therefore threaten sociology's existence. He thinks the danger is that we become popular, it becomes popular sociology. That in fact you will actually go and you will water down, dilute, simplify the professional sociology in order to communicate it. And it will endanger professional sociology. So he's very skeptical about public sociology. Yes. And he probably would say that the critical sociology is part and parcel of professional. So he would reduce all four boxes to one, professional. That's what his. And that's what happened. There have been, since I began this in about 2004, that's 14 years ago, there have been many debates, and everybody places themselves in one box and attacks all the others. So they always attack me. I'm attacked from every direction, but I love to be attacked. So in fact, the debates revolve around the relationships between these types. That's really what the debates are. And in different countries, the relationship among these different types are very different. So, for example, in the United States, the professional is very strong. For example, you might say public sociology is very strong in places like South Africa, Brazil, India, countries where their sociology, the membrane, the divide between the university and society is very thin, and there is always an interaction between the two. So when I go to talk about public sociology in India, or in Brazil, or in South Africa, they say, "What are you talking about? All sociology is public sociology. Why would we do it if it were not public?" So yes. Now Poland is interesting. Yeah. Poland is interesting. You know, in the state socialism and the communism, you might argue that Polish sociology appeared to be professional, but it was often critical. It had a sort of dissident flavor. Critical of the limits of freedom under communism. Some very famous sociologists here were able to work within limits to actually criticize the way society was organized. And in China too, you have a sociology. Most of the sociology today in China is professional with some policy. But public, whoa, that's tricky, that's very tricky, that's dangerous. But there is public sociology in China. I have a good friend, Shen Yuan, who's in Tsinghua University, and he sort of has a little group around him doing public sociology. Critical sociology, yeah, I don't know if that's very well developed in China. So it's these two with a little bit of this, but not much of that. So where do you find critical sociology? Well, you know, in Europe, in France, they're very good at criticizing. In Germany, they're very good at criticizing. So there is a tradition, and where professional sociology is very strong, there usually is also a critical sociology that actually says you professionals are wasting your time on irrelevant issues, and really you should be engaging the public or the policy world, but particularly the public. So critical sociology in the United States complains how narrow-minded the professional sociology is. I don't know if you ever have looked at a journal of sociology coming out of the United States. If you were to look at the American Journal of Sociology or the American Sociological Review, it's more or less incomprehensible. It's difficult to understand. Many of the methods they use are very elaborated and sophisticated, but it's also usually about very narrow problems. And one wonders the relevance of sociology. So yes, in the United States, basically sociologists, as I was saying before, write for one another, and very few people even read the articles we write. Just a few sociologists, yeah. Very sad. But anyway, the idea of public sociology was to push sociology out to publics, to different populations, movements, organizations, beyond the academy. Oh, I don't know. All right, let's see what comes next on this thing. Yes. Yes, so there are two questions, there are big questions, really big questions behind this 2x2 table. The first question is, for whom are we producing sociology? Is it just for us sociologists or more broadly? That's the first question. Knowledge for whom? And the second question is, knowledge for what? Are we in the business of solving problems defined by others, defined by our research, or are we in the business of discussing values and goals of society? Reflexive knowledge as opposed to instrumental. What are we doing as sociologists? Sociologists don't like to ask these questions. I got me in a lot of trouble asking knowledge for whom, knowledge for what. Why are we bothering? Why do we care? Seems a very important question to me. Yeah. Okay. So that's the basis of this scheme. Knowledge for whom and knowledge for what? Yes. All right. So, all right, these are just some small points. Types of knowledge, these are types of knowledge. Any individual sociologist will go through will perhaps combine different types, or perhaps have a career. My career went from policy to public to critical to professional. And now I am an evangelist for public sociology. But anyway, people have careers. And in different societies, we have different types of knowledge dominate. As I say, in the United States, professional dominated, perhaps in state socialism, communism, there was a critical sociology, there was a professional, but there was also a policy sociology. In the Soviet Union, sociology was basically an instrument of the party state. Yes. But you have forgotten all about that, yes. You are too young, yes, right. So yes, that's domination. So different disciplines, different types of knowledge. So in economics, professional sociology is very important, as is policy sociology. In the humanities, in history, in literature, perhaps the critical and the public knowledge is more important. Yeah. But my claim is that we have to do all four, and they're all interdependent with one another. That is my central claim. We need all four. Yes. And a healthy, flourishing discipline of sociology will have all four together in a antagonistic interdependence. Antagonistic, the different parts are antagonistic, but they're also interdependent, dependent upon each other. All right, that's enough of that. Whoa, I'm talking too much. All right, let's see what we have. Why do we need public sociology now? This is my last question. Well, sociology is in crisis. You know what sociology is? You started by saying sociology deals with social problems, but we're living in a world where social problems are not recognized. Societies increasingly across the globe are recognizing only individual problems, and so sociology has less leverage. The perspective of sociology, the linking of micro to macro, is actually losing influence, or has been losing influence in many countries. And so sociology, the idea of a social problem, that poverty is the result of actually the character of the economy and of the state, rather than a problem of individuals not working hard, not being sufficiently entrepreneurial. This idea of the broader causes of social problems, the broader causes, is becoming less and less significant. We are becoming ever more contracted into an individualistic perspective. So anyway, sociology may be losing influence, and therefore sociology has to project itself publicly and convince people that the problems they face are not just individual problems, but problems of a wider society. Phew. Yes, well anyway, that's the crisis of sociology. Then there is a crisis of society. Now, you may not agree with me, but I think across the globe, in different ways, in different countries, society is in crisis, in as much as labor, workers are subject to ever greater precarity, uncertainty. We are also facing problems of nature, that capitalism is destroying nature, and we see this in climate change, we see this in the development of waste, pollution, that is actually destroying the planet. And we see this in terms of money and finance, that in fact the world is ever more in the grip of people who are making money from money, which actually begins to destroy the productive capacity of societies. Yes. Yes. So I think that society is in crisis. Yes, and since to add to finally, sociologists are very gloomy people. Finally, there is a crisis at the university. See, what is happening is that the university is not an autonomous realm, but is increasingly producing knowledge for people who buy knowledge or buy its dissemination. Now, Europe, this country is very interesting in this regard because, in many countries now, students are paying fees that go up and up and up, and I will talk about that this afternoon. But here you're still not paying fees, but there are many other ways in which the university is being subject to market forces, that is destroying the public nature of knowledge, is making it more and more difficult to produce knowledge that will solve the problems that capitalism is generating. So this is a real tragedy if I'm correct that the problems are accumulating across the planet, the very place where there may be alternative imaginations, solutions, is being subject to the control of forces that actually engineer further expansion of capitalism. The university becomes a capitalist university. So yes. So that's why we need public sociology now, because we're living in what I call third wave marketization. And with that third wave marketization, in many countries, there are ever more authoritarian states. So it's a combination of markets and states are squeezing out of existence civil society. And the thing that will defend civil society is sociology, but it too is under a lot of pressure. and has been threatened. And that's why I go around the world talking about public sociology. And I will stop there, and I hope we can have a little bit of a discussion. And I hope something of what I said is clear. Thank you. All right.
May I ask you a question? My question would be, could you probably give examples of the public sociologists now that I'm working for you? Because you mentioned solidarity in Poland, and of course we know the famous book by Alain Touraine about solidarity. And Touraine at the moment probably could be a public sociologist, plus the Polish sociologists who were working on the project with him were public sociologists, right? But can you give some examples of the public sociologists you like and you appreciate?
Good question. Right. Alain Touraine is a very good example.
Yeah.
He's very much a public sociologist, has endorsed the whole idea of public sociology, and sees the importance of social movements as engaging with crucial issues. But what was interesting about that solidarity project that he was involved in was that he saw the sociologist as enlarging the imagination of the participants in the movement. So sociologists have a very important role. So he's a great, not only an example of the practice of public sociology, but also the theorization, the thinking of it. Well, there are many interesting public sociology. The ones I know best are probably in the United States. So for example, there are many feminist sociologists who are very linked into feminist movements. But one of my favorite public sociologists is a woman by the name of Arlie Hochschild. Perhaps I should spell that. So she, for example, she wrote many books, and they've all been at a public audience, but she's also a professional sociologist. So she's producing original sociology. So she looks at the gender division of labor in the family, what men and women do in the family. She goes around and interviews lots of people and asks them how much the women do, how much the men do. And what does she discover? She discovers that they all say 50-50. 50-50. And then she watches, she looks and sees, not 50-50. And it's not 50-50. Women do much more. And she sort of shows that that is the case. And then what is most interesting is she begins to explore how it is that men and women conspire to hide from each other that there is this unevenness. You're nodding in a way that you will totally understand this. But anyway, it's a beautiful book in which men and women conspire together to hide the uneven division of labor in the family. Okay, that book goes out, beautifully written. Oh, that's very important. Beautifully written, widely read, and generates lots of what? Divorces. Because as you know, the whole question, when you read the book, then you think about your own family, and then you realize how you have been deceiving each other. And it generates a lot of tension and conflict. So there's an interesting case of public sociology. Now if we're going to continue with her, she has recently done a study in Louisiana, that is in the south of the United States, of right-wing groups. So sociologists almost study right-wing groups. She studies what was Tea Party, it's called. It was a right-wing group in the United States, and spends a lot of time with them trying to understand why they have so little confidence in the state, why they do not see the environmental problems around them as a product of the state and the economy. And she gets into their heads as to how they construct the world. And what she argues is that many of these white citizens of Louisiana, they see the world in terms of them being left out. And they see the state in negative terms. They see the state as actually promoting the interests of African Americans, of feminists, of lesbians, that they see the state as actually advantaging everybody but themselves. And she argues that basically this white population of right-wing thinkers see everybody else jumping ahead of them in the queue, and this generates an anger. And this, of course, is very similar to Jules' book, The New Authoritarianism, his explanation of actually the popular perspectives in this country and why the Law and Justice Party may have support. It's a very similar sort of argument, seeing how those people who sociologists may see as advantaged, see themselves as disadvantaged.
Is it changing now when the markets and states are getting stronger?
Yes, those are two very good questions, but they're very different. Yes, let's talk about South Africa. Yes, it's really interesting. The social movements in South Africa against apartheid were at their greatest strength in the 1980s, and it was very much centered around the labor movement, and sociologists were very engaged with that. You might say they were policy sociologists as well as public sociologists. And once the new regime takes power, then it tries to demobilize civil society. So you do get a sort of new sort of authoritarianism. And you get the African National Congress, the party state becomes very important. And so actually social movements become more difficult to organize, and sociology has to retreat, and sociology is less imaginative and inventive, in my view, as a result of that. And you can see the same, even in the Soviet Union, in the perestroika, late perestroika period of the late 1980s, there was an efflorescence of civil society, and you got a whole generation of sociology co-ops all over the place that were doing really interesting work. But then once the new regime enters, post-Soviet world basically sort of sat down, squashed many of the social movements and squashed sociology. Sociology had to enter the business school or to return to the philosophy department. And it still maintained an existence, it was as applied sociology or as a policy sociology. So it transformed itself. So when regime changes, yes, sociology changes. Absolutely. But then the first question was the specificity of sociology. Of course there is psychology, psychology is the antithesis of sociology in many ways, because psychology is all about the individual psyche, and psychology sees problems from an individualistic point of view. I believe that sociology should have a psychology, but still it has a psychology to understand social processes as of a broader character. So psychology and sociology don't fit into my scheme at all. Geography, anthropology, they could be collaborators with sociology. They too defend human geography anyhow, defends civil society against excesses of the state and excesses of the market. Yes, and I think it's the case, which brings the two questions together. I think it is the case that sociology tends to thrive when there is a vibrant civil society, and disappears when civil society disappears. So, for example, in Chile under the dictatorship, sociology disappeared, went underground actually. It remained, but it was underground. Same with, in China, sociology didn't exist until 1980s. repressed. And of course, in the Stalinism, whether it be here in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union, particularly in the Soviet Union, sociology was repressed. Sociology in the Soviet Union had a sort of cyclical history. When a new regime, a new party secretary came into power, they would usually run a survey to show how the old one was terrible and the new one would be promising. So they used surveys, sociologists, very instrumentally. But in Eastern Europe, there was a large dissident population among sociologists, and particularly here in Poland. But the point is, here in Poland, there was a stronger civil society than there was under communism than there was in the Soviet Union. And in Hungary, you had a very different civil society that was much more economically organized. Their economists were perhaps the most innovative under the communist regime. So you have to look at each country differently and see the relationship between state, economy, and civil society, and see what is the terrain in which sociologists can play a role. So sociologists have to first understand the configuration, the character of the wider society to figure out how they can play a particular role. But still, yes, there is a general claim that sociologists are interested in the expansion of civil society. That is their peculiar standpoint. And therefore, you get sociology really develops at the end of the 19th century in Europe, when civil society really develops in France and in Germany and England, and to some extent in Eastern Europe. That's a long answer to your question.
Thank you. It's a common question. So I'm studying intercultural mediation. So I would love to mediate, to contribute to this mediation of different cultures. But the thing is, what we, for example, as you mentioned, in communist regimes, sociology was used as an instrument. And nowadays, there come up religious groups like who also, for example, we do public sociology to understand, its main goal to understand the world, yes? And there are some different ways they approach, like Kabbalistic way, Sufistic way, and Salafistic way of understanding the world, or what's happening, yes? And they have also various explanations about what's happening right now. And once we are going with sociological knowledge to them, they say, you represent also other religions. So is other religion, they see sociology as a religion, as a new religion.
Very good, yes.
And is it?
Sure, yes, you could say that. Depends what you mean by religion. We do have our gods, you know, some of them, Marx, Weber and Durkheim, right? Yes. I mean, sociology is very unique in that it still worships its gods. I mean, you know, there was a fellow called Robert Merton who said that a science is a body of thinking that forgets its founders. Sociology never forgets its founders. So we do, in the sense, we worship, or some of us do, some more than others, but let's say we worship Marx, Weber and Durkheim and others. Znamensky will be the new god, perhaps, or Bauman, you know, they're perhaps lesser gods. But I think there is something different about sociology. It is claimed to also be a science. It is a moral science. That is, it has gods, it has a morality. It is the morality of commitment to civil society, but it is also a science. So we investigate the world and our vision changes. How we understand the world changes according to our research. And in fact, what we have in sociology are different research programs. And some of them are related to Marx, some to Weber, some to Durkheim, but basically they advance Now, I don't think religion advances in the same sort of way. So basically what I'm saying is that sociology is influenced, the way we understand the world is influenced by our interaction with the world. I don't think that the usual meaning of religion, so sociologists will say that religion is dogmatic. It doesn't actually change in accordance with the way the world appears and is studied. But yes, I can see that what your point is very important. That the people we study may see sociology as a religion, and that we have to recognize as a truth for them, and will shape exactly how they see the world. But standing and defending myself as a sociologist, I would say it's different from religion. What do you think?
For example, once I was talking with a person who was practicing Kabbalah since many years, and he was telling me, so join me and do this science as a science, and you will understand the world in a better way. And now the person is criticizing me doing sociology. He says, so it is a wrong way, so it will be difficult to understand the world better. And that's my concern.
Well, yes. Well, one can think of it as a moral vision of the world, and religion is another moral vision. So I think sometimes we forget that sociology has its own value foundations. So I think that sociology is usually built on the idea of the expansion of freedom and the limitation of inequality. I think most sociologists stand by those postulates, and on that basis build a scientific program. But they do have moral foundations. And of course there are other people in the world who don't believe in freedom, and they believe in the importance of inequality. So therefore there is a real clash. So yes, I think there's truth to the saying that sociology is a religion. It's not just a religion, but it has a moral foundation. When we read Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, you can see that they have moral foundations to their work. Bauman is the same. Znaniecki, the same. All the well-known sociologists declare their value foundations. So it's not just science. Science is built on those foundations. So yeah, so I can see why your friend might say you've got the wrong perspective. What's his perspective?
Kabbalah. So Kabbalah.
So what does that mean in terms of what he believes?
So his point of view was like Kabbalah is a scientific the way to understand the world. It has nothing to do with the religion, also with the gods. You don't need to believe. Okay, at some point they say, okay, you believe, well, yes, you should say yes, and then it comes to all that things. And so what his claim was like, it is not a religion, it is a way to understand the world from a scientific point of view. And giving his point was like, in the beginning of the 20th century, it became known to everybody. And that's why we have the world achieved this change, or achieved, it caused that change. So I didn't listen much. So because if you want to learn more, so you should dedicate yourself in that way.
So what are you going to do?
I came here.
Are you going to stay here?
Yeah. It's way more understandable for me to follow this path. Kind of, it's way more. It becomes more clear to me. So I have also been activist past, like in the social movements. But let's say when we in Azerbaijan in the beginning of 2000s, we were having this discussion, civil society. It was seen also like a Western project.
Right.
And it was also very difficult to convince people, no, it is not a Western project.
Right.
Our project.
Yeah, this is our project, and but for example, now it is we have state project as a civil society. It looks more diverse than we were trying to do, because they put there some religious groups, some Western-minded people, some Russian representatives, Turks, so feminist groups, so everybody is there. So it's more diverse than
Before.
we were
Imagining. Well, you probably imagined excluding all sorts of right-wing groups, probably. You wanted to. Well, whereas the state is prepared to recognize every type of political group.
Yeah, they have all the time, they support everybody in their way. But yeah, we were having also right-wing people, left-wing people, or people who didn't see them to the political spectrum. But we were just small now, and all we were considered as a Western project. So.
But how do you mean that the state is designing civil society in the region now?
Because they support the NGOs through the state fund. So once you want to get the support and work over there, so you have to collaborate with state. It's not bad, but like everywhere, more or less.
No, that's an interesting question, whether civil society is just a Western concept or whether it's a universal concept. Yes. That's right. And of course, the fact is that many places in the world don't really have a developed civil society. So for me to go to South Africa and talk about civil society, they get very annoyed because their civil society is a very precarious one. And so perhaps it's not. So that means the sociology is precarious and they don't like to think of it in those terms. But no, it's an interesting question, whether sociology ultimately is just a Western religion. But at least as sociologists we should recognize different plurality of moral visions that coexist with our own. We have to recognize that. Even if we think that our own is somehow superior, we have to recognize that there are others. And of course, that's the basis of anthropology too.
But I think we need to be also cautious because those various visions of words have various and not necessarily equally in moral terms consequences. And like thinking of sociology, I'm thinking of Pierre Bourdieu's theories and what he was saying also as a public sociologist, I would say. So for example, that by just the very fact of revealing hidden mechanism of structure and reproduction of inequalities, like pointing at this, which is kind of the core of sociology, we act, and there is no other way, against the interests of certain groups, which, okay, they have their worldview that, okay, we are elite, we are noble people, we have blue blood, so we don't need to work, let's say, I mean, to put it simple. So I think like we also need to be aware that not everyone will be happy with what we are doing.
Oh, absolutely. No. Bourdieu was very emphatic in saying that basically everybody hates sociologists because we are always pointing to the more gloomy side. So he reveals domination that is not obvious to everybody. So yes. Yeah, no, that's right. So when one looks at the way that microprocesses are linked to macro forces, that's a very deterministic way of thinking about our lives. So we're looking, but we also have to see that within that those determinations are not absolute. There is some room for maneuver. So there is some optimism left. So sociologists attempt to recognize the limits of possibilities, but also the possibilities within limits, and that's really the task. And the question is whether Bourdieu. Yeah, do you read Bourdieu? Bourdieu. That gentleman over there just has a little ironic smile on his face. when I say Bourdieu. Yeah, anyway, but yes, so Bourdieu is, he is probably the most important and most significant public sociologist. He's the most important and significant sociologist, but also the most important significant public sociologist of our era. I don't know if you've ever tried to read Bourdieu in any language, but it's basically impossible. And so he writes in a way that is incomprehensible. I always like to say I read Bourdieu for 15 minutes and then I have to go and have a sleep for 15 minutes because I get so worn out and tired of reading.
Some people say that German translation is the best.
German? Oh, really? Alright, so we should all learn German. But anyway, the point is that, even though he is very difficult to understand, he has actually also written, which comes to your earlier question, he has also written texts that are much more accessible. And so, he became, when he died, it was like, I don't know, in the United States, it would be one of the famous Hollywood star dying, a celebrity. He was basically, because in France, intellectuals have very high status, and he was at the peak, at the height of that status. So when he was a real public figure, which has to do with France as much as Bourdieu. And so he was a very, very influential figure of the left, very critical of third-wave marketization. And of course, he was the first person to talk about precarity, or one of the first persons, long before Standing. But yes, he was a very interesting figure. Yes, indeed he was. Yeah. He's one of our gods. Okay. But when
Prophet.
Yeah, he's one of our gods, but as a god we criticize him. And in religion you don't criticize your god, right? But we make a habit of criticizing our gods and building on them and recreating them and destroying them. Yeah, he's really a god. Whoa. He thought he was a god almost. That's not fair. No, I didn't say that. Very interesting figure. Yeah, very interesting figure. Yeah, he, in my view, is the most significant sociologist of our era. I don't think anybody competes with it. His influence on different disciplines, his influence in different parts of the world, is just extraordinary. I mean, China, Bourdieu is God too. I mean, you go to China, everybody's reading Bourdieu. Yeah. Well, if you're a sociologist. Yeah, so it's fascinating how he became such a big figure. Because one of the reasons he becomes a big figure is all to do with the sort of global division of labor, division of knowledge labor, division of knowledge. That, the key to becoming a god for all humanity, all sociological humanity, is to have your work translated into English. And I mean, it's one of the terrible things. They have brilliant work, but they're not in English, people don't, but his work was translated very well into German, obviously, too, but once it's translated into English, then everybody wants to translate it into their language. So that's a key. And of course, being French also helps in sort of disseminating your ideas. So there's a very uneven global structure to the dissemination of knowledge, which we should be very aware of. Yes.
I'm sorry, I have to go back to this problem of the civil society. How would you describe, maybe not describe, how would you explain your idea of civil society? If I might have a comment before, that for a long time I hated the term civil society because in the beginning of 2000 in Poland, and even when I started some courses in sociology, the civil society was connected with the third sector, that means NGOs, and mostly NGOs. So, and we had some kind of typology by Scientiae. I might be broader definition, but anyway, this public some kind of a term that would, because I think that we understand civil society similarly. Yes? As you were speaking about the sociologists who should support civil society, and in different kind of societies, I thought that maybe it is something in between the rulers and those who are ruled. And it could be anything, sometimes it could be some religious organization and so on. Something we would mediate between.
Right.
So
Yes, that is what I was describing is, in political sociology, a relatively conventional view of civil society is the mediation between rulers and ruled, and all the organizations, institutions. That's how it used to be defined. Well, that's how it was defined by Tocqueville, and then by US political sociology. My own view of civil society emerged from the writings of Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist, who argued essentially that at the end of the 19th century, last 3 decades, they developed a whole set of organizations and institutions, things like mass education, things like political parties, trade unions, voluntary associations, that actually transformed the character of domination in capitalist society, making it impossible for there to be some sort of working class revolution in the conventional sense. So for him, civil society was two-faced, that it actually, on the one hand, organized consent to domination, capitalist domination, on the other hand, was the terrain of possible organization against it. And it was always very closely connected to the state. So that's how I work with the idea of civil society. It's quite historically specific in its origins. But yes, it is a contested term. And indeed, many people have used civil society in a way to actually sort of elaborate different forms of domination. So, and that's probably what you're suggesting, that many of the ideas of civil society as put out by the World Bank, for example, are ways in which basically you absorb dissent and you organize people to, in a sense, distract them from struggles. You absorb, and you don't make major transformation of society. That's also sort of one way of thinking of Gramscian view of civil society. It's a way of organizing and redirecting dissent. But yes, it is a contested term. But still, I think it's the term that I still use to defend the idea of sociology. Because in societies where there is no civil society, i.e. there are no mediating forces between dominant and dominated, then you have a very autocratic form of domination in which the dominant do not respond to the dominated. Civil society is usually a two-way set of organizations.
Thank you very much for today. Yes, we invite all for the evening lecture at 5 o'clock in the city center in Barbara.